Story 1. The night I met the Wendigo. It was 10 feet tall and loomed above me. Claws of ice scraped the icy ground beneath emaciated arms. The antlers were torn and shriveled, dripping blood. Its long, needle-like teeth met mine with an all-too-human smile as it peered at me through bloodshot eyes. I could smell the foul stench of death on its breath as it bent closer. With a howl that chilled my blood to the bone, it drew back its head. Still, I was not deterred. My senses had become dulled by hypothermia as the temperature plummeted. I had come here to die, and I knew it would happen eventually. There wasn't much left to lose, and I was in too deep. The object moved to sit next to me as soon as it sensed that I was accepting the inevitable. I looked it in the eye, startled. "Aren't you going to kill me?" Its attitude shifted as it cast a disdainful glance in my direction. For an instant, it appeared wise, nearly human. The sky turned gray and started to talk. "No," it spoke in a low, raspy voice. "Your suffering now feeds me more than if you were dead." I gazed into the obscurity. The object beside me removed a glass jar. Though it was small compared to my head, it was enormous in the creature's hands. Its claws scraped the glass like nails on a chalkboard as it opened it. It cast a low glance in my direction. "You are presently heated by your rage, but all fires eventually go out. It won't be for very long." It was accurate. I had no business being alive at this point. It quickly slashed open my cheek after striking my face with its claw. However, no blood was drawn. Rather, a translucent, milky liquid seeped out the incision. I felt it swirl and billow around my head. Recollections. Wonderful, lovely memories. I noticed my sister, who had wavy blonde hair and was tall and lean, twirling around in her beloved skirt. Her laugh was practically audible to me. At midnight, when she believed no one could hear, she was dancing to the radio. We drove down the highway with the windows down, squealing with excitement. I grinned, but the memories eventually became bitter. I turned the turn too quickly and then saw her body, broken and limp. I watched helplessly as my life burned to the ground in front of me as the automobile crashed into a tree. The thing gathered the haze surrounding me in a jar and closed it, but I felt the heat rising in my chest. I jolted back to a chilly gray world. I experienced numbness. I was unable to feel anything. I had no knowledge at all. What was sitting in front of me with a horrible smile on its face, or who I was, but I couldn't even care at that point. It murmured, "She forgives you," and lumbered off into the darkness. Though I wasn't sure who he was referring to, I realized it was time for me to leave when the stars started to disappear and the snow surrounding me turned into a cozy blanket. Story 2. A guy and his dog just saved me from a goddamn witch and her Wendigo. Holy crap. How even should I begin? Benny has passed away. Also, goat. They're all dead, shit. Except for me. All since I needed to urinate. Man, what the fuck? We decided to camp close to Breck in order to get one in before tomorrow's snowfall covers Colorado. It was Goat's idea. We all agreed it would be fun and something to tell stories about later. He wanted to celebrate something. I can't even remember what it was at this time. The fact that we were partially correct fucks me. After packing a lot of gear, food, and alcohol, we trekked up. For the first few hours, everything went well. But things got fucking nasty as soon as the sun set and the mountains were shrouded in darkness. Initially, we believed that we were simply too inebriated to hear anything. So we all decided to ignore it and act as though nothing was wrong. But eventually, we reached a breaking point where we could no longer pretend, and we made the decision that it would be best if we left right then. So we started packing, but I had to urinate, so I did, and then I walked away into the shadows behind the trees, feigning not to hear the sounds resonating up around the peaks. A howling sound that was peculiar and piercingly high, like the wind knifing through the pine needles, along with some laughter and screaming. My life was saved by that poop. I had hardly recovered when I heard him ask, "Who the fuck are you?" in a Petey-like voice. Next, a louder voice, possibly Goat or Jones, spoke up. "Are you deaf, lady?" Then Tim's voice raised in anxiety. "I fear she might be injured. Hello, how are you doing?" There was a brief period of silence until someone yelled, "Hello, goodbye," in a voice that I was unable to recognize. "Goodbye, till next time. Farewell." I looked around the tree's trunk, confused, half expecting to see something messed up. I also did. An elderly woman was standing close to the firelight's edge. Her hair fell limp and languidly about her pale face, and she was dressed in a yellowish rag. Her countenance, it was unsettling. Her eyes were totally, deeply dark, and she had an ear-to-ear smile. She had the appearance of a real demonic creature of the night, a fucking witch. After chuckling, she exclaimed, "Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye." Jones, Petey, and Tim were the first to depart. They simply erupted into 7-foot tall flames and burned up. They screamed in an awful way. They sound like something I've never heard of before, and I hope not. And the smell, how incredibly sickening. Huge swathes of meat and sinew came off of their bones as I watched their skin bubble and peel. With a menacing hiss, all of their blood just disappeared due to the intense heat of the fire. 3 bodies that were beyond recognition burned till the flames subsided and broke into ashes that were carried away by the wind. Benny and Goat started to run, and they nearly made it, but as soon as she pointed at them, they stopped dead in their tracks, their tongues lolling out and their mouths opening too wide. She had surprised them just by pointing somehow, some way. She laughed obscenely and peered over her shoulder. A massive figure emerged from the gaps between the trees and advanced. It appeared to be the offspring of a monstrous elk and Andre the Giant. There was silence for a time, followed by mayhem. The Antlerman snorted and screamed as he dashed ahead in Benny and Goat's direction. When he reached Benny first, he lifted him far into the air and impaled him on one prong. Slithering down, Benny's mouth was open, but there was no sound, just a line of reddish-brown drool. Benny took off as Antlerman swung his head to the left, forcefully crunching into a nearby tree. He was still alive, though, and I saw him slither ahead as his intestines trailed out behind him and steamed in the twilight. Antlerman advanced 3 paces, came to a stop directly in front of Benny's head, raised a hooved foot, and repeatedly crushed Benny's skull, agitating the cerebral matter. When Antlerman eventually turned around, Benny's face was reduced to a crimson mush, and his perfect, unbroken blue iris, I was looking blankly up at the stars. Next was the goat. He was immobile, and I could see the panic in his eyes as they rolled endlessly, searching for a way out. Subsequently, they came to an end. Accurately said, I was aware that he was observing and hiding from me. I drew back a little behind the tree and shivered when Antlerman grabbed Goat's arms and pulled without halting. I heard a loud pop first, and then another as the Goat's arms moved. However, Antlerman persisted in tugging, and I was unable to take my eyes off of them. I watched as Goat's arms were pulled completely off of his body, completely fucked off, but he was immobile and just stood there, looking like a grotesque phallus with blood pulsing from both holes. Goat was sent reeling backwards when Antlerman cocked his left arm back and Sucker struck him in the face, shattering his nose, and I could see he was dead before he even reached the ground. Well done. When Antlerman turned back to face the witch, she shook her head and said something that almost made me hurl. Ah, ah, there's another one hiding and observing over there. I believe he's having fun. I shattered myself. What the hell? Why tell lies? For a while, I could neither fight nor run. And then there was this noise, mechanical and familiar. And through the trees comes this guy on a fucking Ducati with headlights blazing and an engine roaring, all while wearing a goddamn crazy-ass gas mask. He appeared out of virtually nowhere. I blinked, poised to leap to my feet and sprint. However, before I could, a large, four-legged creature, a dog, soared above me. A big-as-hell dog. Gas Mask was firing a shotgun, and the dog next to him was barking when I heard a loud noise. The shots produced extremely bright blasts that sent a harsh, fluorescent-like glow over the whole area. Abruptly, the dog bolted, sprinting near the ground, directly in the direction of Antlerman, jumping up and grabbing hold of his arm. Gas Mask reloaded, then swung the shotgun quickly in the witch's direction and fired once more, striking her 4 times in the chest and causing her to stumble back while screaming. The dog was tearing and ripping at Antlerman next to her, forcing him back toward the trees. Gas Mask got off the bike and threw the shotgun over his back. He then took a pistol from his belt and fired the entire clip while yelling, "Hocus pocus that, you bitch." And the witch took off, with Antlerman trailing behind. The dog let out a loud bay as it bolted after them. A terrible bugle, like the sound of an elk dying, sounded, and something big fell to the ground. After a few seconds, Gas Mask whistled, high-low, in between, and the dog, coated in intestines and blood, lunged out of the brush. It appeared to be smiling. The man approached the horse at a trot, and as he bent down to pat it on the head once or twice, I heard him murmur, "Good girl." I murmured, and Gas Mask gave me a sidelong glance, as if he hadn't noticed me. "Oh," he replied, "yes, B*TCH. You had better get away. The witch is weaker." Wavering laughter boiled up behind me once more. The dog barked and crouched down, raising its hackles. After taking some rounds out of his pocket, the man cocked and reloaded his shotgun before saying, "Run," once more. "We're gonna handle this." I also did. I took off running. I freaking ran after that. Returned to the vehicle. I heard the shotgun roaring, booming, and shooting from behind me. But no laughing. I'm currently on my way to report this, and I sincerely hope they will accept my story. However, I'm not even sure if I can trust what happened. That dog, that guy, the deer dude, and that motherfucking witch bitch. What on earth just happened? Story 3. How my father survived an encounter with a Wendigo. Though some people have never experienced hunger, everyone is aware of it. It's possible that you have expressed yourself as starving, empty, famished, or hungry. However, have you ever personally faced the ferocious creature we refer to as hunger? Have you ever thought that what you label as starving is really just the tip of the iceberg compared to the monster that eats away at innocent and sane people's minds and souls? The only thing stopping you from indulging in donuts, pizza, cheeseburgers, fruits, and vegetables is someone breathing down your neck and pulling at your skin with bloody nails. However, several people have almost gone hungry. We have been afflicted for ages by some of the worst cases of widespread starvation, sometimes known as famines. China 1959, Russia 1921, Ireland 1845. However, very few individuals have ever experienced hunger or seen the Wendigo, even during these periods of extreme famine, when people's teeth were gnawed and shattered from eating leather and dirt, and animals feasted on the bones and rotten flesh of human corpses. Since Wendigo is hungry, that is all it ever experiences. You might be familiar with the Wendigo from illustrations or heard of it. However, for the majority of those who have seen it, it was their final sight. Thankfully, I haven't seen it, but those who share my ancestry have, and they have gazed at it with hollow eyes. This is my father's story, not mine. He motioned for me to take a seat next to him, pointing to the brown cloth chair, when I was probably around 15. He told me that I was mature enough to understand why he would never allow me to walk in the woods and why we would never travel up north, particularly in the winter. He asked that I chronicle everything that occurred to him so that no one else would have to go through what he did. That's what he informed me. The father's narrative. He pulls out a cigarette, clicks a lighter to start a tiny flame, and places the small flame to his cigarette before taking a puff. My uncle informed me that the woods were some of the most beautiful in the whole country when he thought it was time for me to see the Great Lakes woodlands. Your grandfather needed a lot of persuasion before he agreed that it was okay for me to travel to the north. Of course, winter had arrived by the time he made his choice. In contrast to the freeze up in the north, winter here is mild. Chilly days and freezing nights. How the Native Americans endured months of deep snow and the animals that accompanied it is a mystery. He stops to take a drag from his cigarette and then resumes. My uncle, who had made preparations in case we were to go during the winter, was unfazed. He dressed me and him both as though we were heading to the Arctic. We had on heavy, puffy jackets, bulky boots, gloves, goggles in case we happened to encounter a storm while out on a walk, and bear spray in case we ran into any wild animals. He also carried a .50 Action Express Desert Eagle, the kind that law enforcement uses in movies. It was just in case we came across a bear or a lynx and things got close and personal, not that he really intended to use it. He stops and looks down at his right leg. He was undoubtedly of the opinion that we didn't require it for anything else. We boarded the plane to Michigan sometime in the middle of November. He had booked a regular hotel room in a small town, the name of which he would not reveal, and we essentially spent the first few days acclimating to our new surroundings. My uncle was correct. It was quite lovely. In fact, I don't think the adjective beautiful does it justice. The forest's edge was visible from my window. It was towering and resembled long hairs sticking out of Mother Nature's head, and the fleas were lying along those hairs. Animals such as squirrels, chipmunks, birds, even wolves and foxes would come by and then give up in the shade of the trees. To be honest, I still miss seeing the trees and hearing the tall pines blow in unison. With a sigh, he extinguishes his cigarette on the wooden chair. But I'm aware that I'll never be able to return. We hiked almost every day, enjoying the crunch of the snow under our feet, and occasionally pausing to see the wildlife. We saw bears once or twice. Of course, I was afraid, but my uncle knew what to do because he had experienced a lot while residing there. He would whisper to me, "Don't look them in the eyes," taking out his bear spray just in case. And after a while, it would proceed looking for berries to consume. During our second week there, my uncle made the decision to take me on my first nighttime stroll. We therefore dressed on our winter boots and coats and carried the Desert Eagle and spray. The moon was as enormous and bright as ever, and the stars streamed over us like fireflies welcome us to the forest. For some reason, it seemed even more beautiful in the dark than it was during the day. We continued walking till we reached a trail split. Since it was considerably colder than usual, my uncle decided it would be better to return as quickly as possible. Normally, we would travel left since it would allow us to enjoy the forest for a longer period of time. I did remember the colder weather for a longer period of time than I should have, for some reason. Even though the weather could change at any time, the local weather report was more accurate than that of the northern ones. Eventually, I fell asleep thinking that every news channel had made a mistake. Thus, we persisted, but the temperature dropped steadily as we progressed. By now, my uncle's expression was always perplexed as he continued glancing up at the sky. I looked up, and there was not a cloud in the sky, no signs of impending snow, nothing that would have caused the temperature to drop this low. My uncle quickly positioned me next to him to keep us warm. The journey back was only a mile or so in length. Then it was obvious that there was a problem that went beyond the weather. We continued to walk, taking quick, rapid steps. With an automatic motion, my uncle swung his head in that direction and took out his bear spray. Glancing behind him, I could make out other sets of eyes moving quickly toward us in the forest shadows. With haste, my uncle had pulled out the bear spray and positioned himself in front of me, yelling at me to start packing. Glancing over, I could see clearly now that it was a wolf, panting and making loud cracking sounds with its feet as it stamped the snow beneath it. Uncle was looking up, his finger poised perfectly on the bear spray trigger, ready to shoot them in the faces where they were screaming. Then the wolves ran close by us, as in no more than 10 feet away from us, and they were moving so quickly that I felt a tiny gust of wind brush against my face. My uncle set down the bear spray and surveyed the area with a confused expression on his face. I saw more eyeballs at that point. He makes a circular gesture with his hand around him. There must have been dozens of birds and other animals. They were running. They weren't even pausing to look at us. Just days before, I had gawked in wonder at all the creatures and birds, all the animals I had feared, and a variety of other things in the woods. They were all sprinting. Neither my uncle nor I had ever seen anything like it in our lives. He made the decision to go, perhaps because we didn't want to encounter whatever the animals were fleeing from. My uncle, on the other hand, is not easily frightened. According to the tales your grandfather told me, He had encountered death more times than he could count, including an enraged grizzly bear, a ravenous pack of wolves, and even a person brandishing a gun directly in his face. Even then, I couldn't see terror on his face. All I needed to know was that worry was visible in his eyes. Uncle decided it would be speedy to travel off path through the woods, so our usual stroll had become a jog. There was a clear hole for the moon and stars to shine through above the trail, but off trail, the pine needles covered most of the light, with a few weak lights poking through the dense hide here and there. My uncle continued to walk in a straight line, heading directly towards the town. He may have only been going a half mile when he abruptly halted, causing me to bump into his back. As if he had stopped breathing, he remained still and didn't even make a nice gesture. "Uncle," with a shaky voice, I asked as I glanced ahead of him, my heart thumping my sternum, pumping blood like a bicycle pump. The silhouette of a human being could be seen in the distance, but not enough to make out any features at all, let alone a face. I don't know how long it took, but my uncle began to back down and motion for me to follow suit. "Hey, how may we assist you?" Even though the shaking was slight, it told me everything I needed to know. One of the coolest people I've ever met, my uncle, was afraid. My uncle moved to approach the bear spray with his hand behind his back very, very carefully. But when his hand passed the bear spray and made its way to the rifle, my eyes almost fell out. "Break!" I heard what sounded like a small twig breaking up ahead, and I looked back at the figure after releasing my grip on my uncle's hand. He had moved forward and stepped on a tiny branch that protruded from the snowfall. And after that step, there was a new sensation in the air. Hunger instead of dread or cold. A hunger that verges on desire. "Look, we're just trying to get back to town, so if you could please," my uncle continued, his hand still moving slowly in the direction of the desert eagle. He was cut off before he could say more. My father had turned away from me by now and was staring out the window. Everything happened far too quickly. Initially, there were the swift, unrelenting steps, accompanied by a growl with every stride. Both my uncle and I found it too swift to comprehend. Then there was a gunshot. My ears sounded like a church bell as it reverberated off the trees and bounced back. He fired one shot before it reached us and before it caused him to yell. It struck him hard, sending me and his rifle flying to the left. And then it hit the ground with such a force that it knocked the wind right out of me. Whoa, what screams! I didn't witness it happen, and it didn't kill him right away, but I heard teeth crunch as they passed through skin and met bone. It most likely paused there for a moment, tasting the blood on its decaying teeth before moving on. Though I'm relieved not to have witnessed it, I could definitely hear it. It was difficult for it to resist as it continued to sink its fangs into his flesh, causing a splash and splatter of blood on the ground. It wanted to eat since it had had enough of the taste. There was crunch after crunch, and then noises of shredding and popping. I believe it was removing his stomach's organs. I'm not sure how long I closed my eyes, but I opened them, turned my back on them, and peered at a beam of light reflected from something silver. The eagle of the desert. I got up, still trembling from the tumble. The odd thing is that I wasn't afraid. Instead, I think my brain was injured and couldn't fully comprehend what was going on behind me. I casually stepped forward and toward the rifle, making a cracking sound with my foot. At that point, the crunching ceased. It was then that I realized where I was. At the same moment, we both turned around, and if you could call them eyes, its eyes met mine. I mention this because I have no idea if those were eyes. They were hollow and dark, and I say dark because that's all that was visible in those eyes. And then there was its remaining body. The item that did that to my uncle was really thin, and I couldn't believe it. Its ribs protruded from its chest, revealing bones that were easily visible through its thin limbs and legs. Its head had antlers sticking out of it that resembled those of a deer. He takes a minute to reflect. No, it was not a head. It was his cranium, because that is exactly how it appeared. Like a skull with antlers from a deer growing out of the top of its head. It was tall, even towering above me in that pose, even as it squatted, before it turned back around and resumed devouring what was left of my uncle. He and his partner gazed at one another for what seemed like hours. Did my presence even matter to it? Why didn't it just go after me the next time, please? I turned, took the rifle, and ran without pausing to ask these questions. I briefly thought about shooting it, but I wasn't sure if my uncle's bullet had actually struck it. If so, I doubt that bullets had any effect on this. All I knew was that I needed to leave. Thus, I continued to run without stopping. Even though it was probably only 10 minutes, it felt like an eternity. The town's lights were then visible to me. I will succeed. With hope seeping into my mind and up my spine, I thought. I then heard footsteps in the distance. For a brief moment, I turned around and felt that hope crumble all the way down to my toes. There was perhaps 1,000 or so. Its eyes were visible to me from meters away. They were so black that they stood out even in the dark, without glowing or anything. And it was racing quickly. The speed at which this creature was running astounded me. With all the money I own, I'd wager that this device could easily outperform a gazelle high on cocaine. With my head turned back, I started running again, giving my legs everything I had so I could simply get away from this beast. However, the steps continued to approach closer and closer. I now know why it didn't consume me earlier. Because it was aware that no matter how hard I attempted to escape, I would always end up getting caught by it. And it did. Its fangs latched into my leg, producing a small break in my femur before sending a shockwave through my entire leg. This beast could have picked me up in its mouth and thrown me several dozen feet. It was that strong. I landed head first, with shock and pain radiating throughout my entire body and focusing on my head. However, the discomfort slowly subsided as I began to lose consciousness. It crunched in the background, enjoying the scrap of meat it had managed to get out of my leg. That's it at this point. I will die in this manner. I genuinely thought that I believed it. Then I heard it though. Stand up. My uncle was there. You're not giving up that easily, are you? All I needed were the words. Every feeling that exists in my body. Despair, fear, sadness, and hopelessness. One replaces all of us. Fury. I spun around and fired the gun, which I was able to grasp onto, straight into its face. It turned, as if surprised that I was holding a weapon, but it charged again a moment later. I merely pulled the trigger without any intention. In what seems to be slow motion, I witnessed the bullet launch and enter its eyes squarely. It seemed like a moment had paused. I heard it cry as it staggered backward and grabbed its face. I noticed a flash of terror in my father's eyes for the first time during the tape, and he goes on. I anticipated hearing a tremendous cry or a huge shout when I saw it open its mouth. However, the outcome was worse. It was a human sound, not the sound of a monster. Numerous hundreds, both sexes, are howling with anguish and pain. The old people screamed in fear. I could hear toddlers yelling because they didn't get to play with their toys, and babies weeping. The only thing that will ever make me forget what transpired that day is a single scream that will always be in my memory. Because I perceived a distinct scream emerging from its lips. My uncle's scream. The horror had returned, and the wrath had vanished. My goal was to escape the terrible shouting, not to run away from the light. I stood back up and kept sprinting towards it, but I simply wasn't able to. The dream did not alter regardless of my speed of running. But suddenly something shifted. The screams were ones of wrath instead of agony. I kept running because I had to get away, because I wanted to and needed to. As I ran, the break in my femur grew wider and wider, pressing my lungs against my rib cage as my body needed more oxygen than my lungs could give. I recall the hard tarmac under my feet and the brilliant street lamps welcoming me as I bounded through the woods. My body had exhausted all of its energy when I emerged from the trees, and I collapsed. The last thing I remember before going completely black was the sound of tires screeching, someone watching me on the phone, and just before I passed out, I turned to face the woods. I saw it standing there, staring at my own eye with one eye closed and the other empty. I could tell how it felt without even looking at its face. It despised me, it was angry, and it still needed food. The following morning, I awoke in the town's hospital. By then, I had been gone for 3 days, and your grandfather had arrived by plane after learning of the events. When he saw me awake, his eyes filled with sorrow and his arms wrapped around me. I told him everything about the incident, about Uncle, and everything else, as well as everyone else. They didn't believe me, most likely because they believed that the amount of blows to my head had caused me to see an elderly bear in a monster capacity. They did send a search party, but they discovered my uncle instead of it. Rumors circulated that all that remained was a mess of bones after every scrap of flesh, blood, organ, and even bone marrow was removed. He sighs. I'm sure that Wendigo is still out there, eating innocent victims and hating me for being the one who escaped. There are still more out there, and they won't stop until they are filled, which they never have been and never will be. He hesitates. The voice of my uncle that was in my brain when that Wendigo had me on the ground is the most unsettling notion I can't get rid of. Was that really my uncle's voice ordering me to get up? I wonder sometimes. Or was it that thing urging me to stand up, requiring me to exert a little more effort so that it could improve the kill considerably? Story 5. Wendigo. I grew up on a Native American reservation in the northernmost region of Wisconsin. Growing up as a Native American child, I learned a lot about our people's mythology including many legendary animals and spirits. However, I was never too convinced in these tales, especially when it came to monsters like Bigfoot or the Mishibiju. Until one day, that is, my friend David and I were having supper at his family's house in the middle of December when it must have been quite cold. It had to be around minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. His grandmother asked us to cut some logs at her cabin after dinner because she was going there while her husband went hunting and she wanted it to be pleasant and toasty. We assured her we would, of course, because there wasn't anything else we could do. We put on our boots and jackets and set out because it wasn't too far, less than a mile, if we entered the woods directly as opposed to strolling the road. In the best of circumstances, trekking through occasionally thigh-high snow is hardly enjoyable. But as I mentioned, the temperature was close to minus 10. When we got inside, we warmed up a little by starting a fire with a few split logs that were still there. David continued pacing and glancing around nervously, so I asked him what was wrong, and he told me that he felt like he was being watched. We went outside and started cutting wood after I told him that was ridiculous and that we should start before it got dark. After about an hour, we heard something very faint that sounded like a girl screaming. Thinking it was the wind, we went back to the logs. After a few more minutes, we heard it once more, and this time there was no denying it. A girl was calling for assistance, and the wolf began to howl. We exchanged glances and sprinted in the direction of the cry. We arrived at a location where there were paw tracks everywhere, and all the snow had been packed down. We started calling out to her and trying to get her to respond when I heard the sound that always gets me in my dreams. It was almost like a shrill, spiteful scream. Though I was mentally cursing myself for leaving the axe back at the cabin, that was the direction we were going. So once we got there, we would be okay. At least it's what I told myself, though it didn't exactly work out that way. David started racing ahead of me, but I was able to catch up pretty quickly. Before we could enter the cabin, David fell. I turned to help him up, but there was just a long drag mark. I yelled for him, but there was no reply, so I started moving in that direction when I felt something hit me. I wasn't sure what hit me, but I knew it felt like something was burning through my chest. I looked down and saw that my jacket was torn and blood was all over it. I felt like I was going to pass out, but then I saw it. It was tall, probably around 9 feet, with thick, dirty white fur, bloody clawed hands, pale yellow eyes, and sunken eyes. I didn't know what it was, but it didn't matter because I was losing blood quickly. How could I survive this? I woke up in a hospital bed with a bandage over my chest and a policeman standing next to me. He asked me what had happened when he noticed that I was awake. After I told him everything, he informed me that David's boots and jacket had been discovered in the woods, but he was nowhere to be seen. I haven't been in the woods since that day, and as far as I know, they never found David. The doctor told me that I had been attacked by a bear and that I had hallucinated due to blood loss. Well, that's my tale. Enjoy. It was months ago when I went to my parents' lakeside cabin. It's not a topic I enjoy discussing. Up there, I made one extremely significant buddy and lost a few others. A guide, if you will. And my whole plan was to go on a carefree, enjoyable trip. Fuck it. In a sense, I suppose I did. And so many memories in such a brief time. The pleasant sense of people I had never before noticed. What do you smell like when you pass most people? Some garbage about some loser attempting to pick up a girl, like Old Spice or Axe spray. However, humans are far more than just these contemporary odors. They may smell like pine trees, hate and fear, bewilderment and pure terror. Most individuals are blind to the vast array of delightful scents that surround them. It wasn't until I went to the lake that I realized this. Everything went as planned on the first day. My girlfriend and a few pals were enjoying themselves while hiking and camping. Before the downpour arrived, we were all having a great time. Never in my life have I witnessed that much rain. We hardly made it back to the cabin as rain dumped in sheets. Kevin fell after tripping. Bobby cried out, "I want to go home," and yelled. The first person back at the cabin was my girlfriend. For the others, she held the door open. As soon as we were inside, we made sure every window was shut to keep water out. However, the roof began to leak. Since there was no electricity, we lit candles. Kevin spoke the word fuck. "We're all going to drown." "Kevin, please calm down," my girlfriend answered. "At this pace, the cabin will fill up in months. We will not suffer any harm." Kevin was absolutely correct. Nonetheless, he wouldn't perish in water. Bobby remained silent. Biting his nails, he leaned forward on a rickety chair, looking like a scared child in his corner. Each of us was absorbed in our own thoughts. Particularly me, I believe. I was experiencing thoughts of devouring that I had never had before, of consuming all in the room with a burst of blood and mutilation of flesh. I was frightened because I even started to look at my girlfriend that way. Bobby Kevin, and my girlfriend were all locked here. This small group had nowhere to go as the rain continued to pour. Of course, one had to be strategic, but I couldn't be happier that they were entirely at my mercy. I informed them that I was worn out from the hike up. I stood up, gave my girlfriend a cheek kiss, and headed to my room. I had the entire cabin to myself, and it was the biggest. Something deliciously black took over as I laid in bed. I didn't need to use a pointless scientific device to verify that the Wendigo was in the room with me. "Hi, Jason. How do you feel right now?" the Wendigo inquired. Its voice had a gravelly, somewhat off-key quality. "All right," I replied, a little down. "Could it be that you have a craving for flesh?" I considered his query. I gave it a lot of thinking. I disagreed with certain philosophers who thought the biggest philosophical question was suicide. Whether or not to rip flesh from bone was the human action that was most on my thoughts. The horned creature, its hollow eye sockets piercing, glared at me across the room. I had a sensation that seemed so sensual and perilous that I realized it wasn't healthy for me. I was aware that civilization was a mirage, a maze of buildings, highways, and stop signs covered in layers of red tape and vague aspirations to become the best. Delusions. The Wendigo remarked, "I'm glad you've come to see the light." I got up, head swimming, but not in a bad manner. More like a nice I'm drunk and shouldn't be driving kind of way. My joints were stiff. What followed I truly don't enjoy discussing. Still, it felt nice. Kevin's axe for cutting wood was what I used to kill him out in the backyard. Bobby, too? Kitchen knife death. I consumed both of them. I stripped their bones bare. So, why you could have put them on exhibit in a museum. My fiancée gave me the creeps, and I knew I couldn't eat her alive the way I had Bobby and Kevin. I fled into the forest. In the wilderness, I've killed and eaten so many things that I can no longer count. I spent a few weeks, possibly a month, living in a cave in the woods following the cabin massacre. The Wendigo would come see me and tell me stories about the old days. I would gaze into its lifeless eyes, have a disoriented sensation, and have to resume my search. Thus, the Wendigo and I became friends for a while. When it was all over, I felt dejected and hopeless. I find myself back in the maze of houses, attempting to come up with an ambition that would thrill me as much as what I did that day in the woods. Nothing as of yet. Not even the excitement of being discovered. I'm confident that the Wendigo will shield me and remove all traces of my immoral actions. That is something I trust